What is going on, everybody? It's your boy Jimmy James 59, and one of the things that I'm doing right now is I am going to be, since I've been doing this for about 10 months now. I really started making videos in earnest on November 13th when I decided, that's November 13th, 2021, when I decided that I wanted my channel to have a mid-Elo focus. And really, what I'm trying to do is just be a channel that has some good utility for players who play at, what sometimes we call an intermediate level, and also for players who are trying to aspire to that. So it's not just a channel for people at sort of what we might call a mid-Elo level. It's really a channel for everybody. But when it comes to gameplay, right, that's where I put the focus on, because that is really what I know best, right, and where I think I could be most helpful. And I'm going through and I'm going to be revising some of my tier lists that I've done before, because it's been quite a while since I've done my mid-Elo 1v1 Arabia tier list and thought about, well, what exactly makes a civilization, rank differently at a mid-Elo level versus, say, like a pro player level. And I think that there are definitely some differences. But one of the most enduring questions, right, that I really think of is really, at what point does somebody become a mid-Elo player, right? This is one of these things that there's a lot of discussion about, and I'd like to bring my own viewpoint to that discussion, if for no other reason than to when I go back and redo some of these tier lists, that you will have a sense of what I mean by mid-Elo and how I view it. And so let's go ahead and jump into this, right? The thing that I want to do in this particular video is I want to talk about what mid-Elo and low and high Elo might be, and how we would normally think about it, and why that might not be appropriate given AoE 2DE, and then what the heck do we actually do about it. So, despite how much we care about Elo, there's really a lot of disagreement, right, about what level of skill it actually represents. So we're going to think about that in this video, right? And I'll just say before I jump in, right, if you like this video, especially this kind of content, definitely let me know in the comment section, and I'd encourage you to subscribe to the channel and check me out. So let's go ahead. All right, so let's do this. So, there are other videos out there about the Elo system and how the calculations go, and this really isn't that kind of a video, because we're really interested in, the sort of qualitative interpretation of that. Well, what does it mean to be mid, low, or high? But the thing is, we have to talk about it a little bit, because the thing about the Elo system is that it's designed to have an average of around 1,000, right? And if we take a look at the distribution, we can see that that's the case, right? Elo is what we call normally distributed. Basically, it's a bell curve where most of the population of whatever it is that we're studying, in this case it would be, Age of Empire 2 Elo rank, right? Most of the distribution is in the middle, right? And the mean is about 1050. But if you take a look, this is from AoE 2 ratings, a really nice site here. You can take a look and at this, and you can actually see the median in this is right about somewhere between 1,000 and 1020. So all of this is to say, even though maybe the distribution is maybe a little skewed to the right, it is a really solid bell curve, right? And the Elo system as Age of Empires 2 is actually really important, because it's used to match players of a similar skill level on the ranked ladder. And so one of the ways that you can figure out, so to speak, when you've kind of hit whatever your Elo is if your win rate is about 50%, because the idea there is that you're kind of win one, losing one, and that means, if you're up against similar opponents, right, then you're going to be overall, right, if you win one, lose one, you're not really going to gain any Elo from that, right? You're gonna gain some points and then lose about the same amount of points, assuming that those players are at your skill level, and that's what the system is designed to do. It tries to match you on those. So, that's a great way to see if you're at your Elo, if you're really trying to think about it, right? And there's always win streaks and losing streaks that we all go on, and so I wouldn't even pay that much attention to things like that. What I kind of do is I sort of look, because, it's easy to go on like a 5-game winning streak, and also maybe go on a 5-game losing streak, turn around and do that. you might go like plus or minus 100 or something and say, okay, whatever your high is, probably subtract 100 from it, and that's probably your elo. Unless you're really in the middle of an improvement, right? And so again, that's one of the things that makes elo kind of tough. But if we take a look at this distribution, right? Normally if we're thinking about low, medium, and high, and we have a normal distribution, it should actually be pretty easy to say what a mid-elo player is. I mean, the mean and the median, right, are kind of right there in the middle, and the middle is 1,000. And if we take a look, right, if we go 100 above and 100 below, so if we take a look at how much of the player base is between 900 and 1100 elo, you get about 30% of the player base, right, are, within 100 points of the mean. And if we go out to 200 on either side, then we get about 57%. So basically, about 3/5 of the player base, almost 3/5, are between 800 and 1200 elo. So one thing you might do, if you want to think about this quantitatively, is think about, that's the middle. And so from there, you can kind of take either sort of a strict or a loose kind of conceptualization. A really strict conceptualization would be like, well, look, the average is 1,000, and if you're a decent bit above it, right, you're above mid-elo, and if you're a decent bit below, you're below mid-elo, right? Now, some people would take a looser conceptualization of that, and maybe just say that range, right, between 800 and 1200, where half of the player base is. Maybe if you're above that range, so like 1200 and above, right, those are going to be, that somebody is, outside of the mid-elo range when they're above that, and that somebody is below when they're below that 800. So what you would say is that, well, if you're between 800 and 1200, you are a mid-elo player, right? Because again, it depends on how strict you want to be and how much latitude, because you can go on a little bit of a losing streak. Maybe you try new strategies or something like that, and so your elo might not be exactly reflective at any given point. Now, the thing about elo, right, is that presumably, right, this is something that we would just say, hey, all right, you just look at the distribution and rank people. But this is where it gets really tough, because in AoE 2DE, and we're moving on to the part of the video now why the sort of normal way we might assess this normal distribution and thinking of low, medium, and high is probably not going to work for us. And that's because the game sets people at 1,000 elo, right? Anybody who started fresh playing online ranked multiplayer, right, knows that. And what happens? Well, you typically lose a lot in the beginning. Now, it's worth noting that a player actually doesn't appear on this leaderboard until they've played in 10 matches. And at that point, that's when the ranked queue is really trying to figure out where you are. The issue with that, though, right, is that still 10 games is a really, really small sample size. And so what that means is that throughout at least the bottom half of this distribution, you have a lot of players who are really new to the game, and the elo system is still trying to sort them out. And it's probably not fair to say that the elo system, right, the ranked ladder, has sorted people out after 10 games, right? Normally when we try to think about what constitutes a good sample size to get a normal distribution in data, right, we can talk about things like the central limit theorem, and I can hear spirit of the laws, ears perking up at this. I don't want to get too much into that, but I will tell you that normally, right, we start to think that we can rely on a normal distribution, usually when it's anywhere from 30 to 50 sort of observations we have in a population. Now, obviously in the rank ladder, you get on here with 10, but let's be pretty generous, right? And let's just assume that the elo system sort of gets people sorted out by at least 30 games. So when you get to 30 games, right, that's when you've kind of figured out your elo. And we might ask ourselves, how much of the player base has played less than 30 games who's actually on the ladder, right? So we take a look at this, right? We're thinking about who in the active player base has played between 10 and 30 games. And if we take a look at that, it's actually a really sizable percentage. AoE 2 has an active player base of about 41,000 players, and about 5,600 or so, which is somewhere between like 13 to 15% of the player base at any given time, has actually played less than 30 games. And that's not a small part of the player base, which means we have a lot of people in here who probably have not played anywhere near enough games for the Elo system to have really sorted them out, because, you know, they just haven't, the Elo system just doesn't have enough of a sample size really to do that. And so this creates some issues for thinking that 1,000 Elo as kind of like the middle is a real middle here. And that means that what 1,000 Elo actually means starts to look really different. Think about it this way. Someone who's played 500 1v1s and is at 1,000 Elo is probably going to have a much higher skill level than somebody who has played less than 30 1v1s at about 1,000 Elo. And so what that means is that it looks, 1,000 Elo's got to mean something very different oftentimes. The other thing that's really devilish here in terms of trying to make this claim is that the thing is that if we have a lot of players in this middle part of the distribution, and probably a little bit probably more to the left, right on the lower end, because presumably newer players are losing a bit more, you have a lot of people there who other people who are in that distribution are getting matched up with, right? So, if you are an 800 level player, right, with some experience, you're probably going to rack up wins against a high number of brand new players, right? And so I took a buddy of mine, right? I took a 10-game stretch of his, and you can see, right? Here's 10 games, and he went up against 3 players who were unrated, which normally in AoE Nexus, which is where this data comes from, that usually means that somebody's actually played less than 10 games, and the Elo system hasn't even, chanced to assume what their actual Elo is, right? And so what that means is that if you're in this range, right, in this sort of 1,000 and probably below, but maybe even a little bit higher too, then you're going to probably have your Elo even inflated a little bit, because you're playing against those really, really, really new people some of the time, right? And again, that's not to knock anybody or say, oh, your wins are invalid or anything silly like that, right? You go up, you have the opponents in front of you, you play to win, and even if it's a new player, you're still working on your fundamentals and training and that sort of things, right? So the point though is just that trying to say that, yep, we can just look at the middle of the distribution and say, oh yeah, that's basically the middle of the player base. Well, it's really difficult, right? Really, really difficult to do, and it's probably a bit flawed. And that puts us in really a guessing game to try and figure out what mid-Elo is. And I think that the rule of thumb these days, because of that, is to just kind of assume that mid-Elo is a bit higher than most people think because of the issues that go on in that middle part of the distribution. A number of people consider 1,200 Elo a good standard. I think T90, who in his as an accompaniment to his Low Elo Legends series, right, which I don't think went above 1,000 in terms of the players it looked at, also did a series called mid-Elo Maniacs, and I think it looked at games between 12 and 600. So basically, taking that like 800 to 1,200 range, where there's so many problems in the distribution because of the way AoE 2 starts people, and just sliding the whole thing, right, so that 1,200 to 1,600, right, that would be sort of the mid-Elo range. And on the other hand, that makes a lot of sense, because once you get above 1,200, a lot of times players are pretty experienced in that area, and so you're not playing as many people who are just brand new to the game. I've heard some of the pro players, for instance, Hera, say that somewhere between like 1,200 to 1,300 is where players really start to slow down in terms of their Elo climb. Now, this is where I think saying that a 1,200 player is mid-Elo actually sounds kind of nonsensical. Because if you take a look, players at 1,200 Elo are basically the top 25% of the player base. If you're a 1,300 Elo player, you're in the top 20%. And if you're a 1,400 level player, then you're in the top 10% almost. So what's really strange is, how do we say that players that are literally, in that top 10% of players are mid-Elo? And so a lot of this goes back to that Elo inflation creating some problems. But here's the other thing, right? Another thing to think about is that Elo is really, right, once you get to players that have enough experience, and have been around the game, Elo should be a reflection of certain skills, right? And that takes us back to what we might call sort of an absolute sense, right? Where the Elo number is reflective of, different characteristics to your gameplay that you might have. And so think about it this way. There are so many things to be good at in this game that you have to master. Players who are actually in the top 10% of the player base probably have very few of them mastered. I mean, if I can pick on myself for a moment, I feel like maps like Arena, I almost have no idea how to play. I barely know how to play Nomad. I feel pretty comfortable on open maps, but I still struggle a little bit with feudal age openings and macro in the mid to late game, and what's my army composition to be, and when to take fights, etc, etc, etc. There are so many skills, it's probably impossible to quantify how many there are, but what I can tell you is that for me, I have a lot of skills to improve, so maybe in terms of the actual skills that you're supposed to have mastered by getting to, say, like a 1400 level range where you're at that 10% of the player base, right? Kind of at the top part of that. Maybe you do only have half the skills that you need. And so there's a whole other half that are left to attain. And on the one hand, I think this makes some intuitive sense to think about things in this way. But one of the problems with this, though, again, always looking at the other side of things, is that it gets really complicated. I mean, what do you do with players who in the ranked queue play really only one map, right? You have the arena clowns, you have, the people who only favorite Arabia, some people who just favorite, say, the nomad type starts, right? And so what that means is sometimes you can get players who are really good at some things, but then just bad at others. And so it's really difficult to judge that kind of person. And so I think this is one of the reasons why people always do tend to come back to Elo, because comparing things on like a skills basis, right? It's just we don't really have a solid metric to do it. And given how important Elo is to ranking you in the system and deciding who you're going to go up against, it's often a cutoff for who gets into what division in a tournament, and even some tournaments in general. Elo is not an unimportant metric to the game, and it's one that even if it wasn't decided for anything, hey, people who play ranked games care about it. So we're often like, Elo is something that we have a tough time getting away from. And the other thing, thinking about skill as well, is, one thing we might ask is, are we being too hard? I mean, does Elo need to be at the 50% line, right? I mean, if you think about something like in baseball, hitting a baseball 30% of the time means that you're a pretty darn good hitter. In basketball, if you hit 40% of your three-point shots, you're a very good three-point shooter. On the other hand, right, if you're only making like 70% of your free throws, you're generally not thought of as a good free throw shooter. So, we are often comparing different types with one another and thinking about, well, what constitutes good and low and high and a lot of different metrics. And, if we think about sports even, right, we compare different types of players and different experience players with one another all the time, right? I mean, in sports, we have players who are rookies, who are pretty new to the game, but we still put them in the statistics. Now, something like the NBA and pretty much any major professional sports league doesn't allow anybody who, say, just picked up a ball to play. In AoE2DE on the ladder, that's kind of how it works, right? You can just, you can just turn the game on and start playing. And so at least in professional sports, there already is kind of a sort of trial by fire that players have to go through that assures that there's a reasonable amount of skill level similarity. So it's pretty difficult to say, right, what we should do when it comes to deciding, well, what is mid-Elo? And, I would say for me, from a quantitative perspective, I think I'm the kind of person, I take a really loose sort of categorization of this, and I personally just look at the Elo distribution and say, well, I think if you're in that range, you can probably, you have a mathematical claim to calling yourself mid-Elo. And if we think about that, the people who play ranked games is a really, really small part of the player base. Well, when it comes to Age of Empire 2 players, judging people who play the game, you're probably an above average player, right? Compared to somebody who, maybe only plays against the AI or only plays campaigns. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. Play the game how you want. But, when we talk about Elo, we're talking about competition, right? We have to think about it competitively. Now, the other thing to think about, though, is that, you know, given that if we take sort of a loose conception of what it means to be kind of mid-Elo, when I talk about something and say like intermediate level gameplay, I generally don't use that, or I try not to use that synonymously, say, with mid-Elo, right? You know, intermediate level gameplay, I typically reserve for something being like a little bit higher, right, than, you know, that sort of like right there at the average of the distribution. And the last thing I'll say, right, is that I think given how hard this game is, and how many different ways to win there are, and how many skills there are to master, I think that a lot of us could probably use a bit of humility, right? You know, if you're training and you're getting better, and no matter what your elo is, I think you should be happy that your work is paying off. And if you're somebody who's a really high-ranking player, you probably recognize that you still have a lot to learn. And I think a lot of high-ranking players in the game actually do recognize this, and are often people who really try to give back to the community as well. And so, you know, even if you're a high-ranking player, you know, you probably shouldn't let it go to your head. And so at the end of the day, the vast majority of us are playing this game for enjoyment, not to make money. And I think no matter what your elo is, being able to enjoy the game, that's really the most important skill you can possess in AoE2DE. And if you're able to actually enjoy playing the game, then you're definitely doing something right. And that's honestly the reason, when coming back to sort of the beginning of the video and thinking about why I make these videos, that's one of the reasons I really do it, is that I've played against people on the ladder sometimes, and after a game, especially after a loss, they just feel so frustrated, and they've, you know, sunk a bunch of hours into the game, and they just can't get better, and they don't even enjoy playing the game. And trust me, if you peruse AoE2 Reddit, you'll see some similar comments about people saying, you know, saying how frustrated they can get playing. And I think that some of that frustration comes from the fact that really, until you get very high elo, there are a lot of times when you can wind up feeling disoriented and, you know, like you're in the unknown and you don't know what to do. And that can be frustrated time after time after time. And so part of the reason that my channel is here and around, and I do tier lists that sometimes tend a little long, and post build orders, and just thinking about strategy, is because if there's something that I can do to kind of help demystify rather some aspects of the game, so that way people can just kind of, you know, hey, you know, learn enough to that way they can just enjoy playing the game, then that is that's, you know, a solid day's work for me, and something that, you know, that's why I'm doing this, right? Because I really think that this should be an enjoyable game to play. It's a lot of fun. It's great that there's a game that it's so difficult to master, but, you know, you don't want to let a lack of mastery, you know, and the competitive nature of it dampen that down. But on the other hand, right, it's really fun to train at the game, and you know, I personally just enjoy it. And for me, it's actually more of a stress relief. And that's the thing, for some people, it's a major stressor in their life. And I don't know if, you know, my viewpoint helps other people de-stress from it, but it helps me de-stress from it. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments, right? You know, what do you consider intermediate, mid, low, elo, all that kind of stuff, right? And because again, this is just my opinion, and I could be / probably am wrong. So so just let me know. And with that being said, I'm Jimmy James 59, and I'll see you out there on the ladder. Peace.